Dickens himself was obviously deeply troubled by his relationship to and his thoughts about mothers. And I don't know if this seems so cheap armchair Freudian thinking, but that aggression towards mothers surfaces in the book. Now, it's so unfair for me to really make any character judgments against him, because all I'm reading is another book about him. And this is why I would never mention it to the lady who works with us. But there's a sense in which I think, for me, it's always interesting as a reader to know a bit about where the book comes from, and not to totally buy it, of course. There's always two sides, as we all know about. If there's going to be a breakup, don't believe one, you know. But it's just fascinating to think he was so anxious, and yet he's at the height of his career. Great Expectations is a very powerful book, really well written, really powerful, very intense because it's so short, and yet so troubled. Pip doesn't know who he is. And also, as he finds out who he should be linked with, what you see is more violent, quite gothic imagery. I mean, there's no real sense of the supernatural in Great Expectations, but there's a lot of elements that can be taken as gothic. What I'd like to do is, I'm watching the time study because I'd like to just look at the two endings. And I don't think this is necessarily something you do with your students, but it's interesting for us. Let me just say super briefly, Mrs. Joe's violence, the violence against Mrs. Joe and the attitude towards her is quite misogynistic. The attitude towards Miss Havisham is quite misogynistic. He's deeply anxious about materialism, the filthy notes that he gets wrapped, the shilling is wrapped up with the convict who's stirring his gin and water, and immediately recognizes the file he's stolen. And when he unwraps the covering, they're dirty, sweltering, cowshire covered pound notes, and that's a lot of money. The child has received about, I don't know, £100 or so. Totally inappropriate to give a child that amount of money. The father figure, Joe, is a beautiful, wonderful guy who rather in a beautiful way supplants Pip when he goes back to just marry Biddy because Biddy is in his head available. The thing that's so crucial about Joe is this: he cannot read or write. And that, within the 19th century, is a cultural empowerment. If you cannot read or write, you're not a man. And so, I mean, look at the literacy of Jekyll and Hyde. You know, they're two letters that you are reading along with Utterson. So Joe has no authority because he can't, even as a lovely guy and a blacksmith. And there's a beautiful moment when he sees Pip in London and says, "I know where I belong." And it's the partings welded together speech, which actually would be great to look at with kids, because he's got this weird accent. You could translate it and play around with it, but he basically says this: "I know where I belong in the forge." And Pip goes out to look for him, doesn't know really how to relate to this. When he goes to look for him, because Joe goes off into the city and he can't find him, he immediately disappears, i.e. goes off into, goes into the urban sprawl. Anyway, okay, so just in terms of us thinking together and sensitive to the time, a man called Edward Bulwer Lytton, himself a writer, some sci-fi, some sensation novels, an establishment figure, had read this in draft and said, "I can't believe Estella and Pip don't get together." In fact, Estella is designed to be almost gothic in her lack of maternity, the opposite to any narrative about Frankenstein. She's not a designated angel in the house, wife and mother. She just, and I'm not saying I personally think that, but she's seen as being ultimately as barren as Miss Havisham, sterile almost, and I mean that metaphorically. But incredibly beautiful, but really not nurturing. And so here's the first ending that he wrote. She's married Bentley Drummle, and it says, "It was 4 years more before I saw herself. I'd heard of her as leading a most unhappy life, as being separated from her husband who had used her with great cruelty." One of my almost exaggerated, I used the word almost there, I don't really think it's exaggerated, it's my get out clause, is there's a domestic violence narrative that's, he can't quite tell us this. Who had become quite renowned as a compound of pride, brutality and meanness. I'd heard of the death of her husband from an accident consequent on ill-treating a horse. He dies beating a horse. and of her being married again to a Shropshire doctor who, against his interest, had once very manfully interposed, sub-clauses out of the window here, on an occasion when he was in professional attendance on Mr. Drummle, and had witnessed some outrageous treatment of her. And how materialistic is this? I had heard the Shropshire doctor was not rich, and that they lived on her own personal fortune. You feel like saying, but I thought you were against materialism, you know. But this is, you know, Dickens uses doctors a lot. Bleak House, Esther marries a doctor. The doctor comes in, and how deeply ironic is this for reading Jekyll and Hyde at the same time, as the honest kind of ideal of the 19th century. And that's used a lot elsewhere. Trollope uses it as well. I was in England again, and in London, walking along Piccadilly with Little Pip. There's a wonderful bit here because he pretends Little Pip's his son. And with a servant, remember everyone's called Pip in this book, with a servant came running after me to ask, would I step back to a lady? It's her. Right. And here's what she says. I am greatly changed, I know. To me it's emphatic, only 4 years. And it's not like she's gone from 18 to 22. I think she's greatly changed because she's had a lot of violence used against her. I am overreading her. But I thought you'd like to shake hands with me with Estella Two-Pip. Lift up that pretty child and let me kiss it. She supposed the child, I think, to be my child. This is encountering the ex and pretending you're okay narrative here. Oh yes, this is my child. He doesn't say it's not. He doesn't say this is Herbert's son. I was very glad afterwards to have had the interview. And again, this is my, so I'm not giving you a chance to read this because I want you to see the next bit. For in her face, and in her voice, and in her touch, so I'm overreading this to think that her face is changed. I just want to really emphasize that I am massively overreading here. In case you're thinking, he's completely wrong. That's fine, I'm completely open to that. She gave me the assurance that suffering had been stronger than Miss Havisham's teaching. And that's the bit I think we should all worry about. And had given her a heart to understand what my heart used to be. The reason that's interesting is those lines are in the published ending that I've just done a tiny extract from. Suffering had been stronger than Miss Havisham's teaching. The suffering of being beaten. Miss Havisham's teaching being go and break hearts. So she's a better person because she's now being beaten. I can't think of a nicer or easier way to say that. That's pretty harsh, and that's what he was going to. But they definitely don't end up together in this. They walk away, they're in an urban space, which is a space where you don't really belong. And also, he's doing that quite wonderful, almost funny thing of just letting her think that he's now happily married. And in the Victorian narrative, if he's not married and he's got a kid, there's a disaster. So it's not that. You may or may not, as you're here, remember the published ending, which you probably didn't know was called the published ending. Do you know there was 2 endings, or is that new to you? Okay. There's 2 openings as well. I won't say too much about this now, but if you read the opening of Great Expectations, the first paragraph is spoken as a kind of adult looking back. And then the same thing is repeated again in, I'm calling it the second paragraph, but specifically it's third, when he talks about the experience of being a child. And stylistically, I've always thought it's useful to do okay, who's speaking? It's the adult, the child. There's quite a lot written on that. Here, they're down at Satie's house. Well, Satie's house has been knocked down. She's looking at a fortune in real estate. I'm not even joking, I think that's what they're gonna do. And he sees her through the mist. They just happen to meet each other. Never ever ask why Dickens is using coincidence, because once you start noticing it, everything is coincidence. In his novels, it's like not another coincidence. And they meet each other. And she then says this. They've had a bit of a narrative and they're gonna leave each other. But you said to me, God bless you, God forgive you. And if you could say that to me then, you will not hesitate to say that to me now, when suffering has been stronger than all other teaching, and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I've been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape. Be as considerate and good to me as you were, and tell me we are friends. So she speaks it. And there is a Gothic element to this because of the mist, because of the lack of there being a building, the whole almost surreal Gothic setting. The link is that for the late 19th century text, Gothic is intrinsically psychological. This is 1861, I think, or 1861. So we're not late. And Dickens is always pushing back the psychological. But she's speaking something that seems moralistic, aggressively misogynistic, but also she's saying, I'm better for having a broken nose and being badly beaten. I feel better for that. Now we know that's just completely wrong for her to take on that mantle. It seems so reductive of her character. And her reward is, at the end, he says, very famously, no, it's not Gothic, I think it's not explicitly Gothic, it's got a Gothic trope, in my opinion. I mean, I think there's a slight difference. I mean, obviously you may use that in a different way, but I took her hand in mine and we went out of the ruined place. I mean, if you go back, ruins are very Gothic, so the ruined place. And as the morning mist had risen long ago, when I left the forge, looking back to the beginning of the text, so the evening mist were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. Partings is a phrase that's used, partings welded together. Shadow of another parting. I still don't know whether that means they get together or not. And if that's a question that you are asked, what do you think? What's a shadow of a parting? Literally makes no sense, but as a Gothic trope, a sense that it's almost threatening, there, but not there. It's not certain. And that's the reason I think the book's so interesting. Certainly next to Jekyll and Hyde, the end of Jekyll and Hyde is not certain. It's very ambiguous. Do you think they get together or not?
No.
No.
Yeah, I thought they do.
I don't think there's ever a group that agrees. What do you think, Fiona?
I think they do.
I think they do, because I think her reward for confessing and saying, I'm better because of suffering, which of course, I mean, it's a Christian narrative that suffering brings us some kind of redemption. It's King Lear, you know, which we were just talking to the other day with some undergraduates. Just not so unusual to see the narrative. It's almost as if she's saying, here's the depth of my harsh narrative, I deserved it. I deserved it for rejecting you. Now, I know I'm overreaching